In this video, I'll be making my updated 2026 Senate election prediction as of today, August 30th of 2025. Currently, Democrats are up by about 3% in the generic ballot. That being said, this is certainly not that impressive for the Democratic Party. Democrats were up by 7.3% on polling back in the 2018 midterms, and even then, Democrats were not able to actually win the Senate, which would spell trouble for the Democratic Party in 2026, given that they're currently down in the Senate 53 to 47. This is not to mention the fact that in both 2020 and 2024, polls were off by about 3% in 2024 and by about 5% in 2020. Thus, these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt, and with Democrats not even at 50%, it's very unlikely that Democrats will actually win the Senate. We also see that in approval rating polls as of right now, Trump is up 12% compared to the Democratic Party overall. Thus, it certainly does not look that good for the Democratic Party in terms of their chances of winning the Senate control. So without further ado, let's jump into today's video. Now let's start off here with some of the safe states on the Republican side. This would include the states of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and the state of South Carolina are all considered safe pretty solidly in the Republican column. I would also add the state of Florida in that solid Republican column, as the state has solidly shifted away from the Democratic Party. In 2020, there was no election there, but in 2024, Marco Rubio and Rick Scott both won the state of Florida by a safe margin on the Senate and gubernatorial level. So next up here we go to the Democratic Party and their safe states. I would give the states of Oregon, Illinois, Delaware, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts as safe in the Democratic column, bringing the Democratic Party up to 40 safe seats. Out of all these safe seats here, there's only one that's worth mentioning, being the state of Nebraska. In Nebraska in 2026, it does look like that a relatively popular candidate is running on the Democratic side, that being Dan Osborne. Osborne only lost to Republican incumbent Deb Fischer by 6.7%. However, Pete Ricketts is significantly more popular as a Republican, and given that Fischer won against Osborne by nearly 7%, Pete Ricketts will probably beat Osborne by closer to 15%. Still an underperformance for a Republican, but drastically better than in 2024 with Deb Fischer, so Nebraska is still a safe Republican. Now we go to the likely Democratic seats, as Democrats are currently behind 40 to 47. Republicans, all they need is 3 seats in order to win the majority. On the top of my head, I see 3 seats as being likely Democratic. First off, in Colorado, where incumbent Senator John Hickenlooper will face an unknown Republican challenger. Cory Gardner, as the incumbent, lost by 9.3% against Hickenlooper, so I don't believe that a non-incumbent will do better against now the incumbent senator, John Hickenlooper. Since Gardner was actually pretty moderate, I don't think anyone will make this race a lot closer than 9.3%. In the state of New Mexico, here we see quite the opposite story. This race was not expected to be competitive at all, and yet Ben Ray Lujan, the Democratic candidate, only won by 6% in a year where Democrats were supposed to dominate. That being said, Mark Ronchetti is a relatively strong Republican, and without a strong challenger and without adequate funds, this race will still probably be likely Democratic. Now we go to the state of Virginia here. Mark Warner will face a Republican challenger as well, though it's not clear who that may be. I don't think that the challenger will be very well funded, and Virginia is solidly trending away from the Republican Party, thus this race is also considered likely Democratic. Now we go to some of the likely Republican seats, and this may very well put Republicans over 50 seats. First off, in the state of Ohio. Considering that Sherrod Brown, the former senator from the state of Ohio, as a Democrat, is considering to run as a Democratic nominee, this race could prove surprisingly competitive. Sherrod Brown only lost the race by 3.6% back in 2024 in a presidential year. That being said, considering that Sherrod Brown is now the non-incumbent, it will be much more difficult for him to win, especially since Bernie Moreno was a horrible candidate on the Republican side, and Brown still lost by a sizable margin. It's really going to be difficult for him to win as against a Republican incumbent. Sure, John Huston technically is appointed. That being said, he is still significantly more popular than Bernie Moreno ever was. So, as of right now, polling also suggests that Sherrod Brown is up by between 3 and 6%. Not to mention that polls generally kind of underestimate Republican candidates a little bit, and Sherrod Brown has technically more name recognition than John Huston. Thus, I would still have to say that this race would probably be likely Republican, probably R plus 7 if Brown was the nominee, R plus 15 if Brown was not. Now we go to some of the other races in this election. Let's start off here with Alaska. Alaska could be more interesting because Mary Peltola, the Democratic former representative from the state for 2 terms, is considering to run for Senate. If that is the case, the race could be more competitive, but if not, this race should be safe Republican. Actually, I'll put this as safe Republican because I think that Peltola is more likely to seek the gubernatorial election as opposed to the Senate one. Now we go to the state of Texas here. Texas is more chaotic, but that's according to the primary. It's not really the general election. In 2026 here, we see that there is a very contested primary between John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. Early polls showed that Paxton was significantly ahead of John Cornyn. However, according to more recent polls, Cornyn and Paxton have tightened because Cornyn also showed a very strong response to the Democrats who decided to leave the state of Texas due to the redistricting process there. The race is more interesting to watch because in 2018, the race was decided by 2.6%, albeit O'Rourke was a very strong candidate at the time and Ted Cruz a very weak one. This time in 2024, I think 2026, this will be much more difficult for the Democrats to win. I don't know what Democratic candidate could possibly win this race. Colin Allred looks like the early favorite according to one poll here. Beto O'Rourke could win the Democratic nomination as well, but right now I still have to say that this race will probably be about, I would say, R plus 10 if Ken Paxton's the nominee, and R plus 13 if Cornyn is the nominee. I do believe Ken Paxton will be the Republican nominee, so that will be an R plus 10 race. Now we go to Iowa, where we also have a Republican incumbent, that being Joni Ernst, retiring from the state of Iowa. But Trump won the state by 13, so I really don't think this race will be super competitive. Joni Ernst is not that popular, but she is still above average, so it could be a loss that Republicans lost her, but she is considered more kind of anti-Trump Republican. She was hesitant to back Pete Hegseth, and she seems more annoyed to some of the MAGA electorate, and thus it does seem like that there will be a more MAGA candidate in this race, which really should have little to no impact as to the final result of this state. Now we go to the lean and tilt states of this election. Starting off here with the state of Minnesota. These are all states that would be decided by less than 5 percentage points. In Minnesota, first of all, in 2020, this was one of the states that was not expected to be competitive, that kind of resulted being a moderately competitive, with the incumbent Democrat only winning by 5%, and Tina Smith is now retiring. That being said, it does seem obvious that one candidate, a third party, got 6% of the vote, and it does seem like that most of those voters are probably just young Democrats, and the state of Minnesota has a very long Democratic voting history, which does make this race more unlikely for the Democrats to actually lose. According to some of the early numbers right now, we don't have a lot of numbers, but right now, according to the one poll that was conducted, Peggy Flanagan, the Democratic lieutenant governor from the state, does seem favored to win the Senate nomination, although fundraising seems to suggest otherwise. This one poll is probably an intern. I would not take this very seriously. Right now, it's still anyone's game between these two candidates, and there's 27% undecided. On the Republican side here, there has not been much movement, though it does seem like that Royce White will probably win this nomination. Albeit, again, there's still a lot of potential candidates, and it does seem like that there are more people that could run. So far, there's not necessarily field dominator, I would still suggest that Minnesota is a more blue state, and thus would go Democratic by about 4 to 5%. Now we go to the state of Michigan, where Gary Peters is now retiring, and now we don't really know who Democratic nominee will be as of right now. Now, Peters had a surprisingly competitive race because a lot of people thought that this was going to be easily going to Peters by more than 8%, and Peters only won the race by 1.7. He actually underran Joe Biden, specifically around Kent area here in Grand Rapids, and some of the more urban areas across the state. There's a lot of potential Democratic nominees here. There could even be someone like, Pete Buttigieg could even run in this race, albeit he did decline. Right now, has been a ton of endorsements. There are 3 main candidates in this race here, that being Haley Stevens, Mallory McCrow, and Abdul Al-Sayed. Haley Stevens is the more moderate candidate, the more establishmentarian. Abdul Al-Sayed is the more progressive candidate, and then we have someone here in the middle. So far, fundraising is not very telling. All of them have fundraised between $1.5 to about $2.8 million. We have not seen a lot of hypothetical polling, though according to a general election, it does seem like that Abdul Al-Sayed, the more progressive candidate, is probably going to lose to the more likely Republican nominee Mike Rogers. Mallory McCrow will probably lose as well, and Haley Stevens holds a slight advantage. That being said, all these candidates are probably more, except Abdul Al-Sayed, are probably more, Haley Stevens is probably more recognized than Mike Rogers, but Mike Rogers was the Republican nominee in 2024, so perhaps he does have more of a name ID advantage against these 2 Democratic candidates. Anyhow, this race does seem like to be a more contentious one. If Abdul Al-Sayed is able to win the Democratic nomination, this would probably just end up being bye-bye here to the Democratic Party. It would be really hard to have someone so left in a state as moderate as Michigan, specifically around the Grand Rapids/Oakland type of suburban vote. That being said, there's still a lot to be seen. I don't necessarily know who's going to win. There's going to be a bloody Democratic primary. I do think that Haley Stevens will edge up on top, and Haley Stevens is relatively popular, so this race should be tilting towards the Democratic Party. Now we go to the next state on this list here, the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a state where Democrats have had a relatively solid history. Jen Shahiran is retiring, otherwise this race would not be competitive at all. Right now it looks like Chris Pappas, a Democratic representative from the state, is probably going to win the Democratic nomination. Republicans don't have a very solid candidate. It's not clear who's going to be running. It could be Scott Brown, who I believe was the U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. But if you represented Massachusetts, coming to represent New Hampshire kind of feels weird. I think that a lot of voters may not buy into that. And someone like Kelly Ayotte would probably be a good candidate. The issue is she's not running, so this race does not seem like it's actually going to go Republican. I would give this a slight edge to the Democratic Party. Now we go to the state of Maine here. In the state of Maine, this is a very interesting race between Susan Collins and another Democrat. Collins was expected to lose in 2020, but Sarah Gideon did not even come up close at the end. She lost by 8%. It does look like that Jordan Wood, a Democratic nominee, a Democratic candidate who I have never heard of, is leading the fundraising pack. And Susan Collins still has a massive fundraising advantage. It's not clear what's going to happen, and there is ranked choice voting, which makes this race more interesting. But right now, it does seem like Republicans have the advantage, and pollsters have learned from their 2020 mistakes at least a little bit, saying that Susan Collins is favored, and I agree. I honestly think this will be likely Republican, because Susan Collins won by like 8% in a presidential year, where the presidential election, where Joe Biden won by 9, was on the ballot. Now that this is not on the ballot, it should be a pretty easy win for Susan Collins. Collins should be able to win by at least 5 to 6, no problem. Now we go to North Carolina. North Carolina is kind of crazy because this race, Tom Tillis, the incumbent, who was actually planning to run for re-election, just announced that he was not going to run about a month ago, after it seemed very obvious that he was going to lose the primary after voting against Donald Trump's big beautiful bill. Tom Tillis had a lot of backing and the backing of AIPAC, but he chose not to run. And now it looks like that Michael Whatley would end up winning this race. There is a endorsement for Don Brown for Mark Robinson, but Mark Robinson, his endorsement really doesn't make much of a difference. You look at the hypothetical polling here, it does seem like that it's not so clear as of right now, but on the Democratic side, it does seem like Roy Cooper will be the Democratic nominee, and Michael Whatley is at a disadvantage, but I think that this is largely a name ID disadvantage. I think that as people know who Michael Whatley is, his numbers will be pretty much identical to Roy Cooper, and Cooper is not as popular as people think he is. He only won his governor's race by 4% as incumbent, while polls had him up by 15. Realistically, this race, I would have to give it as tilting Republican, because there's not enough of a lead here in my opinion, for Roy Cooper for him to actually win this race, in my opinion. A 2% edge in polling is nothing when you're much more recognizable as a name, and when polls have overestimated you by double digits. Now finally we go to the state of Georgia. Before we even enter the state of Georgia, Republicans are already at 53 Senate seats, so they really don't need to win this race, and they will still be at the same number of Senate seats as they are right now. Anyhow, let's go to the Senate state of the state of Georgia. In Georgia here, incumbent Democrat Jon Ossoff will face against a Republican candidate that has yet to be decided. At first, it looked like that Brian Kemp was going to run and he was going to easily win the Republican nomination, and then probably be the favorite against Jon Ossoff. The problem is he declined to run, so now it's unclear who the actual Republican nominee will be. It could be Mike Collins, who endorsed Brian Kemp before deciding that he would run himself after Brian Kemp stated he would not run. It could be Buddy Carter, another U.S. representative, or it could be Derek Dooley, who seems like someone that Brian Kemp may actually endorse in this race. Anyhow, it's not really clear what's going to happen in this race as of right now, but it does seem like this race is going to be more contested in the primaries. It could just be that Brian Kemp works his magic, or Donald Trump works his magic and ends up convincing everyone but one candidate to drop out, that being probably everyone but Buddy Carter to drop out, but it's still not clear as of right now. Polling does suggest that this race is leaning towards Jon Ossoff, albeit the name ID is still a significant factor. I do not believe that Jon Ossoff is at a good enough number to be safe. However, it does seem like that Jon Ossoff is relatively popular of a Democrat. His polling numbers are solid, especially compared to Roy Cooper's in North Carolina. And I think that this race, in terms of Georgia just trending blue overall, this is probably going to be a fight for his life for Jon Ossoff in Georgia, but I do still think that the state will overall go to the Democratic Party by probably within 1%. I think that the state of Georgia will again go to a runoff, as it did in 2020, as it did in 2022, but I think in the runoff, it's more likely that Democrats do win, just because of the fact that Jon Ossoff, young voters have more energy, and I do believe that, under a Trump administration, after the midterms are done, it is more likely that Democrats have the advantage in the runoff, and Georgia will probably be tilting Democratic. Anyways, thank you so much for watching today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you want to, click on the election night on your left here for a 2024 election night between Kamala Harris and JD Vance. Thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.